3 seconds for folks to just grab their seat.
I'm gonna sit over here. Okay. I don't know if that's gonna make it weird when we talk. Because this thing's.
All right. Another exciting paper and exciting topic. We're very fortunate to be joined by 2 of the 3 co-authors for this paper, Parth Noble and Chinmayi Sharma, and our discussant, Bianca Wiley. Thank you very much. And I'll let you kick it off.
Wonderful. Okay. So, first of all, I want to say this paper made me so happy because I felt like it was kind of a dare of do you really want to regulate AI? You know, that's what I kind of felt the paper was asking, because a lot of people say they want to regulate AI. And I felt like this paper was pushing using openness as like, if you do, this is what you actually have to think about. And it's a lot. So I really appreciated that at a macro, because I think a lot of these conversations about openness fly around in the abstract, away from proper nouns and the rest of it. And so just a little, I'm going to do a very quick summary and then a few thoughts, and then we're going to talk a bit before we open it up. That's the structure we're going for here. So loosely speaking, what this paper does is make sure that we understand that with artificial intelligence, it's not the same as software, that it has component parts, and that if you want to look at it and understand it well, you have to consider, if we're looking at openness, each of the component parts along that spectrum of open to closed. And so the component parts are model weights, data, infrastructure, source code, documentation, and metadata. So those are all the component parts. And then to think about those parts and the relationship to openness all the way over to closedness, when we think about public policy and law and regulation, the goals of said things. So safety, democratization, innovation, and public accountability. So you can probably picture a bit of a matrix here, of if you're looking at this and then that, and then trade-offs. And that is a thing that was a constant theme through this paper, and it is so critical, especially in a time of, you know, this sort of simplified binaries. There are trade-offs always in public policy, and this paper does a fantastic job of just pushing on that as a reality. It's not doing that evasion, which I see so often. So I really, really appreciated all of that. I also appreciated how much you pushed toward sectors and talked about the consequences and the thinking about the trade-offs within healthcare versus justice versus, say, agriculture would be a good one on the heels of this conversation. And I think one of the reasons that's so helpful to tie it to something you closed on was, especially with, I don't know about everyone here, but to me, when I understand how the public is looking at this issue of AI and technology, I feel like they're getting the idea that if we regulate it, we're good to go. You know, like, don't worry, the law has it. That's not it. You know, I think everyone here knows that better than most. At 46, it was only maybe till my late 30s that I was like, oh, access to justice. Yeah, it's a bit of a, you know, that's an angle that even the general public, I would say, isn't super aware of, that even if you've written laws in a way that's the easy part, if I may. I'm not trying to minimize what that is. But the point being that at the end of the paper, you touch for a minute on liability as a concept. And I think by looking at, and the way that you frame these questions, how do we not load all of the concept of liability into both law and into the industry? Because it's not to say that they shouldn't have responsibility, but there is also something to be said when we're talking about how important context is, that we have the people who are experts in all of the sectors carrying some of the capacity responsibilities, carrying some of the accountability responsibilities, carrying purchasing decisions, carrying maintenance decisions. So I really like that, because I think now I'm just going to draw on a couple of lessons. Teresa Scassa is back there, one of the woman who's taught me so much about openness and the open data and open government world and how that works with law. One of the things that we ran into in open data, open government era, so 2008, 9, early 2010s, kind of like law, it's the capacity to support openness. So no matter what you would eventually decide about a lot of what's in this paper, the actual way that that is going to be implemented or not, or operationalized or not, resides at the question of capacity, stewardship of whatever the asset is, but all the implications for what it is to have it out in the world and functional. And so this question of who's going to be holding the bag on the operations of openness, I think is a great provocation that flows from the thinking and the framing in this paper. And I think that is fantastic, because I think if we're going to think about access to justice, for me, non-legal thinking, it's like, how do you operationalize and preempt? How do you make justice accessible well prior to a court, or well prior to this sort of model that we have that's very punitive? How do we build what we know should happen with these technologies when they're in operations into pre-existing capacity, into pre-existing operations, into people's jobs, into places where people get paid and can be held accountable? And I think if we try to shift much more of that work into the sectors that are thinking about deploying these technologies, we actually have a shot at it being resourced. To go back to what Vasanthi talked about, with you can't talk about anything without the economy. In this context, you can't create cottage industries of people being paid by the same people who they're trying to hold accountable and think that you're going to get somewhere. Like, this is not it. So we really have to figure out what is the economy of accountability on making decisions about openness. What does that look like? How do we staff it? How do we fund it? And I think one of the biggest and best answers in all of this work is to not reinvent the world or reinvent the shape of the world in the name of AI. We have professional associations. We have workers who know how this will and won't be good for them. We have unions. Like, we have a lot of other places where I think we need to think about the downstream of all of this. So I think a couple more thoughts and then a couple sort of questions for you both. One of the cultural issues, I'm very hung up on culture, is that, and what we saw with open data and open government is that, and I always go back to John Ralston Saul, Voltaire's Bastards on this one, the government in Canada, its default culture is secrecy. And if I would have known that to the extent that I knew it when I started my open data, open government adventures, I might have laughed at myself. We have FOI problems. We have every problem you can have. And so we can't skip over the fact that the culture in government, and so some of the cases we're talking about defense, or we talk about where things are developed in a military context, there's not going to be, like, no, they're not going to be into openness regardless. And if you're getting it open, you're getting it late. And so I just want to say that if anyone is less open than the government, it's a corporation. So we don't even have mechanisms for a corporation for openness. And there are probably cases where, this is a legal question, the company has a fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders not to make things open, or to make things open for strategic advantage, which I think is the case with the Meta idea of we're going to open the technology so everyone has to build on top of it. Like, that's a overused term here, but that's weaponizing openness, right? So that question of the openness idea and the cultural reality, I think we have to hold those in pretty serious tension and not replicate the sort of idea that it's basically, this is only going to be done when it's good for the company or good for the government. And all the other cases, history says, like, not so much. And then I think another thing that came to mind was Lucy Suckman wrote a paper called it's a short one, Uncontroversial Thingness of AI, in 2023, I think, Data and Society. It's like maybe 6-7 pages. What I love about it is it questions the idea of technology as a noun. and as an object. And it sort of references and harks, I think it calls back to some of Ursula Franklin's work, where she points to it as process and as relationship. And so I think the idea that it's a product to be open is one thing. It's a very different and probably more expansive concept to think about procedure around it being open and who can and can't participate in that. And where it's prescriptive, as she makes a distinction between prescriptive and holistic technologies, where prescriptive are control technologies and holistic help, the person using them make choices about them. And the other thing that came up, I think, frequently in this paper was about sort of the need to get this right here, because if not, it's hard to put some of this back in, or once you set a structure and once you regulate. And I just want to raise that is a tension with ethics in a way, because it's a really great short post by Daniel Monroe, which looks at Feynman's error, and it was regarding development of atomic weapon, that you have to go back to your decisions constantly and check on whether they were right or not. And so I think figuring out, when you think about putting this into practice, how do you hold as much space for reversibility? And if you can't, and I loved yesterday, Nadia mentioned to absent consent, like if that's off the table, you got a problem. And it sounded like in this paper, there are a couple of particular cases where that's not on the table. And I think those are the places where you have to think harder about yes or no at all. Is this a thing? Because if we can't walk it back, what are we doing? Right? Like that seems a pretty bad idea. And then two more industrial examples, and then I'd love to talk a bit about this. You mentioned telecoms and the unbundling approach. And I don't know how it has been in the United States, but in Canada, regardless of unbundling or having common carriage or whatever, it's been a disaster in terms of oligopoly. So I think not only seeing where it was beneficial, but also making sure to address where it didn't work so well, because it also, just to think on other sectors, automobile, agriculture, I think this is the closing, like real macro thought for me, which is there are other sectors where the cost of entry, mining, it's incredibly high. You could make a comparison in some cases to the infrastructure. Like you can't participate in this, you can't be part of it because it's too expensive to participate. But that they never were, I'm careful with democratize, because I always think it's hard to use democratize when it's not actual public power moving into what's on offer. But I just think about these cases where, why are we working so hard against, because it is an open source software, right? So we've got lots of industries where it's been a problem. But I think it's interesting to look back in time and say, could we have done more of this in other sectors? Would that have done something? Would it not? Just to try to keep a longer arc going, looking that way with industry where barrier to entry and cost were so high, because they continue to be so problematic. Cars kill the most people in the world, regulated like crazy, all kinds of infrastructure still killing people. There's no tomorrow. So, which is awful. But to swing it around to maybe just to open up, if any of those things, if one thing I raised there prompts a response, and happy to have a couple more questions. But I just want to end by saying I absolutely love the rigor of taking the question, do we want to do this? And pointing to how much work it is. And that, plus the amount of money and time it would take to do it properly, is almost like calling a bluff to me. Do you really want to do this? And if you want to do it, this is what it is. So I just so much gratitude for the work, and I really, really enjoyed it. And thank you.
That was a lot of comments, and I will try to address some that were the most interesting to me. I love that you took away that this was about trade-offs. I feel like in tech, every paper has to be about trade-offs to some degree, because that's what we're doing here. I think, so Parth and I, as origin stories for a co-authorship, met a long time ago and talked mostly about open source software. And my priors and his priors kind of was pushing back on this idea that we should be holding open source developers liable for security issues in open source software. And we felt strongly that that shouldn't be the case because of the role open source plays in the ecosystem. But then we fast forward to the AI space, and we started hearing a lot of the conversations by individuals that wanted to use openness as a pushback on regulation of, like, look at how great we are, don't hold us liable, this is incredible for the world, it's going to liberalize things, it's going to make things safer, it's going to allow more participation in the ecosystem. And, like, you know, you can kind of smell the bullshit there, basically on the point of, if you have fiduciary duties to maintain profitability for your investors and are also going to make an extremely resource intensive product open to some degree, there must be some benefit coming back to the company. But then we also saw openness on the other side being like, there's like a fear mongering aspect to it from the government of openness is terrible. If we make model weights open, then we are going to have like bioterrorism and deep fakes and, like, you know, a whole host of like parade of horribles, where there are definitely anecdotal examples of open weights being used poorly, but there wasn't a lot of empirical rigor supporting the fact that this was the end of the world and open weights, like model weights, should never be made open. And so basically, I feel like we were seeing in real time these trade-offs, and then just not a lot of actual knowledge about the sophistication of AI ecosystems in these conversations. And so we wrote a paper that was like taxonomy paper, which is like the least sexy kind of paper you can write in scholarship. And we're like 3 different people who I think have differing ideas on things like liability. I think one of our co-authors who couldn't be here, Alan, is much more skeptical of the way in which liability would play a role in promoting responsibility in the AI ecosystem. I, on the other hand, am generally like carry a big stick and use it frequently when it comes to software developers. But I think the fact that we could write a paper together is because of the fact that we aren't trying to answer any of these questions in the paper, which is, again, a very unsatisfying thing to do. But it is for like the purpose of, this is a really complicated question. And so, like, I laud states like California and Colorado and Canada for trying to proactively address the risks and benefits of AI. But like slapshot regulation that doesn't understand quite how sophisticated and interconnected and like it's like a techno-socio-legal product is probably not going to have the outcomes that they want.
Mm-hmm.
I'll try and zoom in on your kind of discussion of prescriptive versus holistic, and kind of the question of how much control do users have over the underlying technology that they're being exposed to. And right, this question is the heart of the ideological open source software movement, which interestingly did a lot of development before corporate, specifically it was the free software movement, before the corporatization of that movement developed open source software as a distinct ideological movement. And what we're seeing here is something going from the opposite direction. Open weight and open model AI is originating in the corporate environment, not by consumer advocates based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, trying to create a world in which consumers control their computers, but by corporations that are trying to assert control over an industry by having them be the first movers and trying to be the first and second movers as often as they can in the hope of capturing control. And that kind of gets to the point of the goal of open weight models is oftentimes to be prescriptive about what type of technologies consumers are going to be exposed to in the future, and to try and make sure that that corporation that opened the model is the one who controls what comes next.
And that reminds me of the reason I get really itchy with democracy. I mean, generally speaking, yeah, like it's hives generally, and then in this narrow context, the idea that and Ursula Franklin talks a lot about this too, is that technical systems reduce or eliminate reciprocity. And this is it with this idea, like this sort of idea that it's democratic, but you're not in charge of my thing, but you can do it downstream. But like the heart of it is never up to you. And so I think even this term being mainstreamed into this conversation, when it's private infrastructure is really off. And it is, that's another thing I like about your component parts, is it's one thing like this experience we had with data, say, or metadata or documentation, like it's lightweight enough. But you get into like that heavy infrastructure piece. And it kind of reminds me of running, because it's also a question of like who should be weighing in on some of this. Funny examples, sometimes it's counterintuitive. Like when I used to run public meetings, the reality is that the government and staff, and they're imperfect, of course, but their full-time job would be to say steward a park. And so you don't have people who come in twice a year, tell you everything about how you steward the park, because that doesn't make any sense. But you have to narrow it and be specific. And that came to mind here as well, because even some well-meaning like friends of the park can be doing things that are damaging to the park. And there's all kinds of power disparities and all kinds of issues here. But I think that honing in on who and where and with what authority to do X in each of these segments would be interesting, because I felt like you're both nodding, right? Like there's something in here about you just don't open general purpose, like, have at her.
Yeah, so in open source software, I'm a maintainer of a moderate-sized open source project, and we get lots of user feedback that is really bad advice. A third of our users want us to never change anything because things are working and they're scared we're going to break them. A third of our users want us to break everything because they need a new feature and the only way to get that feature is to break everything. And a third of our users are actually going to have some feedback that we take action on. And what we're seeing here is it's not really clear what Meta's goal is with Llama and what DeepSeek's goal is with openness. One of Meta's big wins in the first couple months of Llama being public was getting all these academics to design Llama specialized versions. It was standard to release Llama deltas, basically how to change Llama in order to get it to do better in one task or another. And this allowed Meta to really, I'll use the cursed word, democratize their actual development of their products and understand how to make better versions of their own products. And presumably, some of that technology has been picked up internally and quietly rolled into new AI assistants integrated into Messenger, and God knows what other Meta products have added an AI assistant. And we kind of see this specialization, I think, fall out of, and in a way that really is not the tradition in software.
Right.
And I feel like we were focusing a lot on infrastructure as the very heavy part of AI and the thing that isn't quite so open, which is definitely true. But I feel like operational data is like an undervalued part of the AI ecosystem, because so Parth and I talk about this a lot, but I love the terms capacity and culture that you used, but in terms of culture, there was a massive shift from the open source community going from kind of academics and sort of libertarian, John Perry Barlow-esque individuals that wanted software to be freely available and within the control of the users, to now, like, I think about 50%, if not more, of open source contributors are paid employees of companies, and you have companies open sourcing their products as well. So even in the traditional software context, you are seeing that there is a commercial benefit to companies of engaging in open source products, because like Part said, it's like a prescriptive technology. They can shape the direction in which open source projects go when they're on the inside, and they can also build complementary products themselves because there's so much information that comes from seeing how people are engaging with an open source project. I think APIs are also like a great example of this. You had platforms in like the early days of things like Twitter and Facebook make a lot of APIs pretty widely accessible and easy to use, so that you'd have third-party developers build things that were dependent on those APIs. And there was a ton of upstream benefits, both because it would add users because they have kind of these beneficial third-party features, and because you were getting a lot of data on like how the API was being used, what was like a popular third-party app. And it allows companies either to like hoover up the other third parties that were building useful things, or build it themselves internally and then eventually close down their APIs. So you see, like, I'm sure anyone here who's a developer knows that tons of APIs are now extremely restrictive and basically impossible to use, and that wasn't always the case.
Right. And I think this discussion of like how this plays out in practice. That's what I kept being prompted to think about through this, which is why it was so helpful and productive. Two things that come to mind right now. One of them is the product life cycle, which is great. Oh, so we're going to stop for questions. We have 15 minutes. Oh, 15 more minutes? Okay, cool. Thank you. Is the product life cycle, and I'm going to hold it against democracy, because one thing is like democracy for me is a between elections. For the most part, elections, it's like, yeah, you got to do whatever, but it's like such a small part. And the in-between election stuff, I think a lot about enfranchised. Who's enfranchised, who's disenfranchised, both legally, but also from an accessibility, and there's an entire, for reasons people have time or don't or anything else, right? So if you hold up, when we think about, let's say participation, so I'm not making myself itchy, say participating in all of this, you go to the life cycle. And then I want to bring in 3 sectors of this. So the life cycle, if you think of product life cycle in operations or product development, you go from like designing to like, do we do this or not? Then you make it and you have to deal with maintenance. Then you might sunset it loosely. There's lots of versions of that. But where people can come in and for what and with what authority? Because a lot of the stuff is happening post-design, like after deployment or just, but it doesn't have like maintenance questions in a lot of the capacity. Like when are people being tagged in? So they might be tagged into design, but are they tagged into maintenance, or how would they, or do they have the time to do that? And then to finalize this, there's the 3 sectors, because when in the democracy debate in the participation debate in AI in Canada was like civil society didn't really get to talk much. And if you were to take a conversation about AI to the general public, I used to say that would blow the whole thing open, because it wouldn't make any sense to have a 2-hour meeting about like it would be really difficult to pull that off, to have a coherent meeting. So then you think about your paper, where you have context. And the 3 contexts that I think about is, if you think about military, right now, Ursula Franklin was a pacifist. So when I think about her work right now, pacifism is not well received. Everybody is going to go up. And her point was, as long as there's an enemy, there's demand for investment in military. And so even Canada is talking about nuclear weapon. Like, this is stuff that's now, it's all resurfacing, right? So as this world order is shifting, there's going to be that. In that context of military and open, no. And participation, big no. Labor feels like probably the most opportunistic space to bring a framework like this, to think about it through a worker's perspective as to having to deal with it. Do they want it? Do they not? How would they use it? How would they be participating in it? But the third one, which always maps back to the military, is stuff gets developed in the military in secrecy without a business model, and then gets dumped into the consumer realm. And then how are you supposed to participate, right? So I think, like, do any of those 3 stick out? To me, the labor one is the one that feels like it has a lot of opportunity. But was there anything you didn't include in the paper on either? Like, I think the military piece is so vital, and flies in the face of a lot of the openness stuff, but also how the general public is supposed to participate. Because I'm hearing you talk about academics, or, like, we know who is drawn to a meeting about a technology topic, and we know who's not there. So any thoughts on that sort of participatory piece on any 3 of those that are expansive or didn't make their way in here?
This is, I speak only for myself and not for my co-authors, but you brought up professional associations, and a paper I wrote before this paper was a call for mandatory professionalization of AI engineers. So requiring them to get licensed and having those sort of centralized, not tied to any particular corporation or employer, professional associations that set standards. And one of the big critiques of professionalization, which is a very valid critique, is that it is it is gatekeeping. It is not accountable to the public in the same way.
Mhm.
You are deferring to experts in a way that is problematic. But I think that's just a function of poorly set up professional associations. If you theoretically had
Agreed.
professional associations where you had multidisciplinary licensing boards, you had procedures and institutions that collected information from the public, theoretically, you would have better participation. I think that where my magic bullet solution doesn't work, though, and I don't have an answer for this,
Mhm.
is participation in the decision of whether or not to build AI in the first place.
Yes.
There's like a lot of path dependency with the like, if you build it, they will come. With AI, once you really, and Margot Kaminsky has a great paper about risk regulation and the shortcomings of risk regulation, of how risk regulation assumes the like continued existence of the product or sector that it is promoting regulation for. And so it's just curbing risk around the edges and not questioning whether or not it should exist in the first place. And so with AI, we're trying to like minimize harms without a process by which the public can or cannot say that they want it in the first place in a particular sector. And theoretically, if we had AI engineers professionalized in a way that they felt a genuine, and you brought up the word culture, but like a culture of social responsibility, that might be a group of people that could reflect the public interest in conversations around whether or not to build AI. But obviously, there's a whole bunch of issues there with you don't have labor collective bargaining for the tech sector right now. You don't have a lot of systems in place for even extremely well-paid AI engineers to be able to like make decisions within their companies or have their opinions heard.
And that's such a good power base, because to me, I'm not a union. I have never been unionized, so don't like to speak outside of my experience with it. But in the context of government, unions could be bringing, it's like you could negotiate in procurements on things that they have to use, but you have to have openings on the product side. Because this is the problem. Like right now, if you have to procure something and you're a vendor and you look at that kind of requirement, they're like, no, thank you, don't want you as a customer. But I think that's part of getting at like where are the checkbacks and the maintenance, and they're like, how can existing power structures try to like shape from where they're at?
Yeah, and I want to expand a little bit more on labor as
You should brag about your personal experience with labor.
Do it.
as
Do it.
as a former elected officer of a labor union
Yes.
that was primarily so in higher education in the U.S. there's been a huge push towards unionization, and what we've seen is that the unionized grad workers have been an interesting population of incredibly highly educated by definition, and low paid unionized labor. And it's been a successful push kind of creating these solidarity and kind of what's been interesting though is how much the campaigns around on grad campuses have not centered on wages outside of the public sector. In the private sector especially, there's been focuses on non-discrimination, on working conditions, on health and safety, on working conditions beyond. Cornell just settled a union contract last week, and their focus was primarily around discipline and discharge and trying to make sure they can't be unjustly fired from their PhD programs or stripped of their funding. And what we're seeing is like this professionalized class of labor unions growing and getting more militant and being more aggressive, helped in the large part by the labor organizing has been helped in large part by the low wages and the demands for higher wages and for protections around kind of income security. And in a way, we saw the tech sector really trying to kind of kill labor unions in the prior decade by preemptively giving into control and demand of the workers, right? The pre 2019 picture of a Silicon Valley office is one in which not only is there every perk you can imagine, including a free masseuse, that's a real perk that you would frequently find in Silicon Valley offices, and on-site healthcare, which was incredibly common for a long time. On top of all of these like big perks, they also would have these regular town halls, anonymous feedback forums, and ways for the labor in these tech companies to feel heard. And we saw successes with that in terms of Google employees killing projects, working with military contractors. That doesn't happen anymore, right? Especially in kind of the work from home revolution and the effort to return to office, the corporations in the tech sector have really tried to shut down and end a lot of the democratizing elements of their culture and their structure. Democratizing in this case, meaning the workers having control over the company. And And what we're seeing instead is much more kind of focus and especially Musk's takeover of Twitter has kind of set a example of how far companies can get away with going on this, and plenty are trying to follow his lead in trying to end labor control of these tech companies, which is interesting because has been small organizing pushes towards traditional labor unions in these tech companies, and we'll see where that goes. Especially now that we've seen the Screenwriters Guild of America has a section of their new contract which regulates how generative AI is incorporated into screenwriting rooms, right? And so we're seeing this world of labor unions that are trying to think about and care about kind of AI, and similarly, I suspect the Actors Equity and other acting guilds are going to really focus on likeness and AI data there, and AI training based off of people's likenesses. And so there's a lot of kind of open questions on what comes next. But those are my takes on labor.
That's fantastic. And I think related to the town hall, maybe I'll close with a little book recommendation and then any closing thoughts from you. But there's a handbook from the woman I learned public consultation from, and it's called Discuss, Decide, Do. And part of that titling is because it's always that you need to talk to people, ideally 3 different times with time in between. And again, want to reference Nadia's presentation yesterday about AI having a really bad time with time. That time is something that we need to structure into discussions, because the reason for a lot of openness is participatory, whether it's transparency, whether it's for journalists to be able to see things, whether it's for workers to participate or the general public, right? So the point here is that book is helpful because it helps you see the difference between like a town hall where the transportation agency is just telling you things. Because part of what you have to do if you're a steward and if you want to say, I'm doing the open thing, is you have to say what's on and off the table. What are the conditions under which this occurs? Like, I think if we're going to take this and push it, you have to push to be specific. Because if all the openness is that you can look at something, sure, but then you're just really doing a town hall of communication out and all that capacity that's lacking. So, okay. Okay.
Hi, my name is Mike Fulfrumkin. I'm from the University of Miami Law School. I love the paper, but I have 2 comments about the paper and one about things you said afterwards. And the first comment about the paper is, I'm afraid, it's sort of a complaint, which is if you're going to talk a lot about a matrix in the beginning of the paper, I want either a red pill, a blue pill, or at least a chart. Yes. I kept saying, where's the matrix? Yes. And there's no chart. More seriously, substantively, in the latter quarter of the paper or so, you talk a lot in spots about trying to create a level playing field between open source and proprietary models. And I don't want to talk about the substance of that. I want to push you to do more definition about what a level playing field looks like. Because I didn't know what you thought it looked like, and I suspect it didn't look like what I think it looks like. I mean, I could tell you a story about, the poor beleaguered open source companies that didn't get sued by everybody because everything's open and visible, except we can't find them and they have no assets. So I think you need to divide that little submatrix between government exposure and liability exposure, because you can have liability exposure and still be judgment proof. As for the big closed source models, they're deep pockets. They have a lot of lawyers, but we can sometimes figure out what they're doing wrong just by looking at the behaviors that's happened. They get sued. So I just need to know more, because I didn't really know what you thought, and I didn't understand how it drove the policy conclusions. Now, here's a crazy idea. People whom I generally don't necessarily agree with have proposed having sort of trusts for data trusts. What if you were to propose insurers by some other name, who would be the people who would stand between the open source creator and the public, would do some due diligence, and then would say, okay, we're giving it our good housekeeping seal of approval for to go out in the public, and they would be the liability shield. Right? They would be the fall guy if it came to that. They might be not for profit. They might set up a suite of them. The one doesn't take the fall for everything. But it did seem like a mechanism to achieve part of what you wanted. So just an idea. Third minor point, just in the discussion. Professional associations, great idea for ethics and all that. we're living in the US right now in a time in which these lawyers, that's just not worked, right? The lawyers have acres and acres of professional ethics rules, the bar associations, all these things. Courts have rules. Lots of firms, big, rich firms, are behaving in ways which are not, I believe, consistent with professional ethics. So I would not put very many eggs at whatever price in that basket.
Do you want to respond?
Because we only have 15 minutes, I don't want to take a ton of time to respond. But yes, we definitely need a chart. That is a great point. In terms of what a level playing field is, I think that the reason we don't define it, and I will only speak for myself and not Parth, is because I don't even know that we have consensus as authors or that there is consensus right in terms of policymakers on what the level playing field is, because there are some arguments that it is inevitable that AI will be an oligopoly. You will never really have kind of the in your garage open source developer the way you could for traditional software. So maybe level playing field looks like even in the flawed world of telecom, level in terms of highly regulated with the goal of making sure, at least within the oligopoly, there's equal footing. And then for professionalization, absolutely hear you. I think that law is a great example of how there's been tons of failings with professionalization. I will say that in this particular moment, especially in the US, there is actually like 1 point in favor of professionalization in how firms and bars and the academic associations that govern law schools have come together to kind of decry and express outrage over the executive branch's decisions and its attack on the legal field. And so there's something to be said about kind of moving beyond just individual companies and organizing to some degree to at least have an opinion on that.
Hi, Andrew Selbst, UCLA Law. So I also really like the paper. For all that you say, a taxonomic paper is unsexy, I think it's great. And again, that's basically all I write. Also, you know. So a couple, comments / questions. Once in the beginning, I think it's the accountability section when you're talking about openness. You kind of talk about transparency as if it's part of openness for accountability purposes. And I think in the open software movement, right, that's not necessarily seen as the same thing. And it seems to it's kind of, it's a boundary that is being elided here a little bit. And so I wonder if if maybe separating out like accountability from documentation and things like that can be done with entirely closed systems and a government like mandating that they come in and you produce the documentation under certain conditions. That's not an open system, but still doesn't impede that kind of accountability. So I wonder if you could work with that a little, or maybe move that around a little bit. You talk about trade-offs in different domains for different kinds of AI. So you talk about healthcare and critical infrastructure might have a particular spot on your matrix versus like research-driven fields. But I wonder what happens when the entire world is using the same 5 foundation models, right? And if AI policy should be different in these different domains, but we're all using the same AI, how do you sort of reconcile those ideas? And then finally, when you move to the normative side, I get, Ginny, that you think the sort of position against openness is overblown, but you don't really support the position for openness at all. You have like a paragraph and then jump right to how to implement it. And I said this to you offline, but I feel like the main benefit of open source was the ability for everyone to innovate on it and help. And then you say repeatedly through the paper, like you can't do that with AI. And so I think maybe supporting the affirmative case for openness, rather than just stating that you think it should be that way, is probably helpful. Because honestly, I'm kind of a skeptic here. Like, why do we even want the openness? Like, I absolutely take your point that maybe the concerns against it are overblown. I don't see the benefit necessarily. Some of the benefits you talk about, but anyway, that's all.
Parth, you wanna?
Sure. Yeah. So I fully understand what you mean by, I think I fully understand what you mean by the transparency is part of openness in terms of, and we were kind of conflating the two in a way that's maybe not how this open source movement has conflated them in the software side. And I mean, yeah, certainly we can do more unbundling. that's the title of the paper, so we should probably do more of it. Um, but but also at the same time, there is, I think, an openness that is inherent in. So we conflated documentation, kind of model card information, with kind of usage logs and records about how things are being deployed and how things are kind of operating, and perhaps those should be separated a bit more than we did. And I think there is kind of some history to requiring government access to parts of those and maybe public access to model cards. And so there's definitely a space to split that more. And for the different trade-offs for different fields with the 5 foundation models, well, I mean, personally, I won't speak for my other authors when I say this. I don't expect that we will continue to have 5 foundation models for all eternity. I suspect as time goes on, we're going to see different models diverge more and more work done on top of foundation models to prepare them for a particular field. And so I suspect that so this is my personal technology predictions as a practitioner in the field. And so definitely kind of hear what you're saying. And I think that's kind of my response to that, is that I don't think this is a permanent state of being. And yeah, we probably should defend openness more. That's.
I think for the affirmative case on openness, I think part of it is I'm skeptical about implementing the anarchist sort of open source software version of openness in the AI space. I think what we're trying to do is say, like, openness is a, like, the journey to openness doesn't have to be putting all of your source code and documentation up on GitHub, and that there's other ways to do it. So, like, things like sandboxes or having kind of like regulators be able to come and demand open book inspections. But another big thing that, like, we all talk about is there aren't meaningful academic conferences in the AI space in the same way that there are in other fields that, like, shares very important information around things like safety, security, et cetera, in between companies. So, like, that sort of information sharing and openness is another part of it. And then I had another really excellent point that I've absolutely lost. But thank you. Those are all really great points.
Hi, I'm Sue Gluck, formerly of Microsoft, currently employed by my cat. And just my viewpoint is, of course, informed by many years in industry. Microsoft owns GitHub. So you're right about your
An
statistic.
uncontroversial thing.
So I love the paper because one of the things, like, in-house, going to lawmakers, regulators, or the bright young people who work for them, is educating them, bringing them up to speed about difficult topics. And certainly staff members love to get a reference to a paper like this. So echoing the feedback, super helpful. Echoing Michael's point, you need a chart. You can't tell me you're going to show me a matrix. And at the end of the paper, I went back and went, where was that matrix? Like, what? In your mind. So you kind of have to do that. I think to do things like that, you need to create some more room in the paper for yourselves. There's whole portions that have no footnotes, and they take up room, right? But I think you can create room without having to create a second paper out of, a subset of this paper. By looking for repetition, you've got the 3-author problem. Compass, the 2 separate things exist in the paper as if it wasn't mentioned earlier, that kind of thing. I loved your the discussion of the EU AI Act's shortcomings, like drawbacks of the approach to data governance and transparency, but the transparency discussion felt a little repetitious. So refer back to other parts of the paper, and I think you'll create some room for yourself to do more of what's awesome. Let me read a sentence to you from your paper on page 52.
That's exciting.
By selectively opening AI models under governance principles that align with democratic values, the US and its allies can ensure that international AI adoption is guided by transparency and accountability rather than authoritarian control. How very 2024 of you. And I think you can make the point as effectively without referencing particular countries. There's another spot where you wax poetic about the awesomeness of the US and fighting against I can't even say the word. Yeah, I'm so allergic to it. But anyway, I think you might want to take a second look at that. So anyway, great paper. Loved it. Thank you.
So I will say we definitely need the chart. There's a little bit of path dependency where we switched to referring to it as a matrix in, I think, the last 48 hours of writing the paper, instead of what I wanted to do, which was a high dimensional hypercube and include a whole section on n-dimensional geometry. But apparently that's inaccessible to lawyers.
No, I vote against that. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Parth is very flexible and amenable as a co-author, which is great. We definitely have the 3-author problem. There's tons of redundancy in the paper. I think it's because this is very early stages and we were doing a lot of throat clearing and a lot of like, does this still sound good when I write it 15 pages later? And honestly, that sentence doesn't sound great. So the exercise maybe worked. I think it's hard because none of us came into this wanting to write a national security paper. And then now the conversation around AI openness has become a national security conversation. Yeah. And then also when we all decided to write this paper, the world was very different in 2024 than it is today in this country and beyond. And so we need to think about how we want to think about the geopolitical sphere.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll try to be brief. Great paper. I'm Ryan Kalo at the University of Washington. So my advice for this paper would be that you stick to description in this paper, and then you write a follow-on project where you engage in depth normatively. Because I think that I had a lot of questions about the normative commitments of the paper. For example, if we're quoting, I don't know what page it's on, Sue, but I'm just going to quote from the paper. Trade-offs are the defining feature of technology policy. I don't think that's right. I think that's the defining feature of cost-benefit analysis, which is reflexively where we turn normatively in the Western, context, especially in the United States. That's what we do, cost-benefit analysis. Another thing I want to point out is equitable treatment promotes fairness and practical policy outcomes, right? Fairness versus practical policy outcomes. One is grounded in thick normative commitments around justice. The other is, pragmatism. And so I think that you would do well to step back from the project and say, we did all this wonderful, descriptive, important work, and explained that it tees up certain puzzles, questions, maybe you want to call them trade-offs, but then have a separate normative project where you say, because I mean, what would an anti-racist do with unbundling? If you think about Orthodox Jews on the Sabbath, or you think about the Amish, they don't sit there and they go, well, we're AI would be, really inconsistent with our longstanding centuries of community values. But on the other hand, you know what I mean? I could play Candy Crush. That's not how they consider it at all, right? They ask themselves, in their technology policy among the Amish, is to ask themselves, is this consistent with community values? Would our community values survive the introduction of this? And if so, what are the ways we could mitigate the invariable erosion of our values? So maybe we need a payphone to conduct furniture inquiries, to sell furniture, but we're going to put it in the middle of the public square. We're going to make it in a transparent, way so that it's not going to be in the home, right? So I just encourage you to when you think about normativity, don't just reflexively accept the American pragmatic tradition of cost-benefit analysis as though that were the only lens, but rather you're teeing up this rich, fertile area. So sorry to go a little long, but okay.
That is incredibly helpful. I think that we don't necessarily all agree on our normative commitments, and so it is probably worth reserving for a future paper. I think in terms of trade-offs, maybe trade-offs is not the right term, but I think it can be as capacious as you want it to be as a term. And so like even in terms of like legal theory, philosophy, you can have like a utilitarian analysis or a deontological analysis and also be thinking about trade-offs of different principles. And so like I think genuine harm to culture and tradition would be something that you have to compare to like the utility of a telephone in a community. The two can be incommensurable and still like an inevitable like balancing that would have to happen based on making that decision. And I think that in terms of tech policy, like this is something that we don't talk about enough of like privacy is extremely important and fairness is extremely important, but so is access to like digital finance for, you know, communities that don't have that, or, you know, like healthcare data, and like maybe there are trade-offs that we're willing to make in terms of privacy to get access to healthcare. So I absolutely take the point, and I wonder if there's a way I could not use the word trade-off and still get at the same balancing.
We good to do one more? Yeah, great.
Okay, hi. I'll be very quick. They're very minor points. Jesse Wu, policing project at NYU. That's where I work. One, I think you could actually need two charts versus the matrix, and then when you're describing the kind of model architecture and weights versus architecture versus, you know, source code, you know, I think like I work with lawyers who are very sophisticated in their understanding of AI, but they wouldn't really be able to like have a model of what that looks like. And if you're, you know, hopefully targeting this to lawmakers, right? Like they just give them a chart. And the second one is, I was a bit surprised that in your discussion of the supply chain, there wasn't. I was looking to see a discussion of those, like the GPU API, like CUDA, basically, right? And sort of how important that can be in the supply chain. Like, I don't know if I actually could train a model on an AMD like GPU, because I've only ever used CUDA, right? And so that really like tends to lock you in certain ways. So that's it. You don't even need to like reply. Yeah.
Let's see.
Well, I will say that I was at an AMD workshop a few months ago, and they want everyone to know that you can theoretically train a model on one of their devices. I tried to do so at the AMD workshop, and after 2 days of working with one of their engineers to try and get it working, I could not figure it out. So not to say that AMD has some work to do, but I think they have some work to do.
Okay, on that note, thank you so much for this. It was wonderful. Thanks, everybody, for the conversation.
Thank you so much. That was a really rich discussion. I really loved it. We have a member of the U Windsor Engineering Mars rover team who's just going to give a 1-minute introduction to the rover that is sitting out in the hallway, and then we'll take a break. And we'll push the next panel start time back by 5 minutes, only 5 minutes. We'll start that one on time because I don't want you all to be late for lunch.
Hello, everyone. My name is Muhammad Ali. I'm here on behalf of the University of Windsor rover team. We are a group of engineering students. We aim to design and construct a rover, which will be competing at the Canadian International Rover Challenge. Before I start, I want to say it brings me great joy that the University of Windsor is holding We Robotics at our beautiful campus. And I would like to give a quick shout out to Kristen, Robin, and the We Robotics committee. And before I get into the technicals, obviously I don't have the time frame, but I would love if you guys can come join us outside. We have a lot of unique features about our rover, and we have a lot of parts for display as well. Just to give you guys, or just to pat our team on the back, last year's competition, we did place 6th internationally, 3rd in Canada, and 1st in Ontario. It's amazing feats. Thank you guys so much. It's amazing feats for a first-year team. And as a second-year team, obviously, we only aim to exceed those results. But obviously, I can't spend the whole 2 minutes that I have talking about how great of a team we are and how well ran we are. But yes, I would love to connect with all of you if I haven't. And it's been a pleasure listening to the conference. And I look forward to the rest of the day. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much. All right, please feel free to grab some coffee, some snacks, and we'll get started at 11:30.